Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm speaking with Chris Cotter, who is the co-owner of TaylorMade Media and TaylorMade Films. Chris has been a producer and director in the multimedia industry for over 20 years. He's a frequent traveler, working and journeying in the continental US, Europe, Africa, Central and South America, and Europe. Chris also has experience working as an audio specialist and music producer as well, and having spent most of his adolescence and professional life studying and performing music, his experience in recording studios began while working with Grammy Award-winning producer Tom Hambridge in Philadelphia's Sonic Studio. Chris has gone on to work on many projects in studios around the Philadelphia metropolitan area and decided to develop his own professional record label called Tribe Sound Records. Chris's sound integrates many genres of music, including rock, folk, hip hop, jazz, funk, and Latin styles. He has taken private lessons and master classes from internationally recognized educators, and he's currently studying under Dom Famularo. Chris also plays with his experimental rock band Wave Radio. And to add to his long list of accomplishments, Chris is also a voting member of the Recording Academy, or at least at the time that I procured the information. I'm pleased to have Chris on the channel. Welcome.
Thanks, George. Happy to be here.
So to start, I want to ask about your previous travels. You explain in some of your blog posts and also at the beginning of your documentary, Refugee, the Eritrean Exodus, that you also always had enjoyment in traveling, and the experience of seeing many different places helped you appreciate the wide variety that the world has to offer. What got you into the hobby of traveling, and how did it shape you as a learner and a global citizen?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that travel is kind of a fundamental need for people to understand kind of the world around them. And my travel began at, I think I was 19, and I had a few friends kind of tragically pass too young. And it sort of freaked me out, right? And so my intuition was just kind of like what I thought would be flee. Plus, it coincided with me graduating high school and not quite sure kind of what I wanted to do with my life. I knew that I had passions, but I didn't know if I should follow them and make a career out of them or whatever. So anyway, by myself, I took a train out to visit my brother who was living in Northern California at the time. Long story short there, I took a train out. I saw the country. I met people along the way, especially because I was traveling by myself. And I just really enjoyed that feeling. So much so that as soon as I had an opportunity to get out of the country, that's what I would start to do. So I saved a bunch of money. I did a backpacking Europe trip. And then that was super eye-opening to see Europe, but I just felt like I needed to see more. And I sort of always wanted to visit Africa. When I was younger, it was always about the animals that would draw me to Africa. And I always wanted to go on a safari, and I met someone who was heading there to climb Kilimanjaro. So I just kind of tagged along. Again, I saved money for like a year, I think, and went thinking that I would climb this mountain, and at the top of the mountain, I'd gain all this perspective and just be kind of a life-changing event. And the hike was nice, right? It's 72 miles, 19,000 feet to the top, and the hike was great. But that's not really what kind of gave me that sort of perspective on life. What did give me perspective on life was more meeting the people that would either guide us, right? And we'd have people that would come with us and show us the way. And then even past that, we did do a safari, and we were fortunate to do a safari with just a friend who lived there. So we just rented a car together and just drove around. He was a guide. And then meeting his friends. And it just felt like some of the people that we met, just the amount of joy that they had. And from my perspective, I think that some of these people wouldn't have nothing. So how could they be happy having nothing? And then seeing the smiles and being able to talk to them and learn deeper. And for me, at a young age, it was a really kind of a catalyst to choose to do what you love, because if you do what you love, then you're not really working, right? And it also helps me realize what matters and what doesn't matter. And to me, what matters is, obviously following your passions, but also family, safety is important. Being able to have your basic needs met. And until those trips, I thought my basic needs were basic, right? Things like, I don't know, a television and, my music stuff and all of my items, like these things, right? I thought that was what my basic needs were. And then as you meet other people and you realize, no, your basic needs are friends and safety. A roof is helpful, and things like that. So that's where it began. So sort of that trip to Tanzania, and and some of the other things that I had done up until that point, and then it just sort of started a fire, made me want to go back.
Well, you talk about the fulfillment of traveling, and I'm sure it's been an enriching experience for you. What have the people who go along with your journeys or people that you meet tell you when you explore? Do you get to experience new things that you wouldn't have otherwise, or how exactly would you explain that?
So you're saying the people that would accompany me to
Hmm.
these places? Sometimes I go by myself, because when I go by myself, I find that I meet more people. I'm a little less shy when, when I go by, well, you have to be less shy, right? You have to talk to people. But not sure. I think a lot of the times if I'm going with other people, everybody's got sort of their agenda, right? So people want to see this or people want to see that, and we're just kind of experiencing that. But I mean, if you're talking about other related journeys, excuse me, like going to the Horn of Africa, the refugee camps, that's a little bit different, right? So climbing Kilimanjaro, doing the safari, that kind of stuff is like a vacation, and we're just kind of, in a way, just kind of traveling just to experience like fun stuff, right? And there's not a lot of seriousness to absorb on those sort of trips. And we're all doing it together. But for example, going to the refugee camps in the Horn of Africa, and I brought Scott with me, and at that point, Scott was an intern in the recording studio, and he was the guy that didn't say no when we were in at a meeting, and I was like, we have an opportunity to go to these refugee camps to tell a story. He was the guy that didn't say no, right? So for him, I think it was a pretty eye-opening experience as well. And I think he was a really good travel companion because neither of us really knew what we were getting into. We had some people to talk to, we had some people that could guide us, we had a translator, and we're just sort of open to the experience. And I have found, and I don't know if this is answering the question or not, but I have found that if you don't plan too much, I find that I have a lot, I have a better time because I'm not too rigid with my plan. So you can follow where the story takes you if you're making a documentary, or you can follow where people suggest to go this place because it's an interesting place to go see. You have that sort of flexibility versus like a rigid scheduled plan of attack.
Well, at the beginning of the documentary, you said that when you traveled, it always felt like you were, quote, passing through, and you wanted your next travel plans to mean something. What did it mean for you to document an experience about a situation that very few people know about?
That story came about when I was, so we'd start the film company, and we had done, business videos for people in the area. And I wanted to take a push into documentary filmmaking. And a lot of companies would start making shorts, a little thing here, a little thing there. We decided we would just go big. And we were introduced to John Stauffer and Mike Slosnick from the America team for Displaced Eritreans. We talked to them about the story. I was turned on to the story by a friend of mine's dad, who was a writer. He wrote The Black Hawk Down, Mark Bowden. And he introduced me to the topic and then introduced me to the America team for Displaced Eritreans. And we spent about a year researching this topic. So, and I've talked myself into a moment where I forget your question. What was your question again?
Yes, so I really want to know, what was it like to experience or to document something
Right.
that many people really don't have any idea about?
Yeah. So anyway, then I'm in the right direction. So as we learned, we realized that, yeah, not many people know about this huge humanitarian crisis going on in the Horn of Africa. Deciding to make the documentary, then releasing the documentary and being able to educate people. Um, I don't think at the time I even knew what I was getting into, obviously. And the feedback from the documentary has been great as far as it's really helped some people. Some lawyers have used it to help their asylum cases for refugees. Some refugees even have been able to play the film for friends that have no idea what they went through to understand a little bit more. In an hour, you get kind of the idea of what a lot of people go through to be a refugee, right? So for me, I'm proud of what my team and I have done. And yeah, it's fulfilling for sure.
Well, also at the beginning of the documentary, you're going through your computer and headlines flash throughout the segment of all these different uh, news articles of atrocities that had taken place in Eritrea. Did it concern you, or was it sort of intimidating to try to get into the subject matter because it was something that you hadn't seen before?
I don't think, I mean, there were a few times I was intimidated on the trip, but I don't know. I kind of like that sort of energy of like the unexpectedness of travel. And I like the energy of exploring places that were so far out of my comfort zone, um, that, it's just, to me, it's exciting. Uh, and the whole curiosity kills the cat thing, saying that people have, I don't know, so far we've had many lives here, so it's not, I don't think I was definitely not concerned about it as much, going into it.
Well, what were your first thoughts on the country itself? Eritrea is, of course, a country that many people do not know about. Did you have any prior research to do, or did you watch any supplemental videos to get an idea of what the country was like?
Well, I did a lot of reading, and there were a lot of accounts by refugees that we read about, reports from organizations like the UNHCR and Amnesty International, and other organizations like that. Uh, I, watched a ton of YouTube videos, whatever I could kind of get my hands on. So there was a good amount of research in the beginning, so I kind of knew what I was getting into in Ethiopia. Now, I wasn't traveling to Eritrea, so I felt pretty secure about the places I was going to. Plus, I was following people who had already been. They've gone to these refugee camps. They've they've inspected the refugee camps. You know they've already done it. So I didn't feel like there was much of cause for concern there because, well, except for the Afar region, that was the one refugee camp that we went to that was sort of undocumented.
So you do some reading and research about Eritrea, and you notice that the Independence Day celebrations are occurring in Washington, D.C. on May 24th. In the documentary, you spoke to someone who supported the regime, and you spoke to someone else who is against the regime in the same day. And you were pondering about the conditions in the country. You're asking yourself, what was Eritrea really like? And you also saw the very serious divide between the protesters and the supporters at the Eritrean embassy. How conflicting was that to see Eritreans on both sides of the issue? Were you trying to keep an open mind on the matter?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was conflicting more than it was confusing, right? Um, I think the first person you're talking about, I think he says his name Sam. Sam in the documentary, and we had a really nice conversation with him and his friend who's kind of off camera in there, and he was trying to explain to me that these protesters that were coming up were liars, and so it was just, yeah, it was just really confusing. But more than anything, it just made me want to get to kind of the truth of the matter, whichever way it really went. And yeah, it made me confused that, there's this person, Sam, who we talked, and I got along with him, and he was a nice guy, and like he believed what he was saying, but he had also been in the United States, I think most of his life. So I don't know if he really had the history to really be that accurate in what he was saying. And same with some of the protesters. A lot of the protesters were in the United States most of their lives. And so it's just these two sort of colliding worlds that just that felt like the only way to really get some answers was to go to a refugee camp and talk to people who had just left and who experienced it right then.
Yeah, it's important, I think, to highlight that point because it may be confusing for people who are interested in trying to get into the subject of authoritarian regimes, that there are people who support and people who are against dictatorships in other parts of the world. And I'm sure that it wasn't easy initially to have to come across that subject as someone who was really trying to get an informed perspective on the matter. But did you try to get a visa to enter the country? I know you went to Ethiopia to visit the refugee camps, but were you wanting to try to explore Eritrea inside the country and try to get some of the information from some of the people inside there?
I didn't have an opportunity to get a visa into Eritrea. Um, and I think the reason for that was like safety concerns. And yeah, so that just didn't come up. And honestly, it also wasn't really in the budget to do that as well. We started this with no money at all, and we finished it pretty much with no money. And I still don't have any money really from the documentary itself, but it was never really about the money. But money does, determine what you can and can't do. So for us, it made sense to go to the refugee camps. To me, that was more important than going to the country of Eritrea as well.
So take me through some of the planning and the preparation that you had to go through in order to establish a working itinerary to go to the refugee camps in Ethiopia. You said that you visited the Hitsats and Shemelba camps with your colleagues who were filming the documentary alongside you and also had an interpreter. What was that experience like of getting a working schedule in order?
Uh, Working schedules are always in the works for stuff like that. We had an amazing fixer. And if you don't know what a fixer is, basically any problem that you have somebody that kind of knows the lay of the land, who could fix problems that you have. Like we landed in Ethiopia and they lost a piece of our luggage, which was important for the trip. And this guy just kept running to try to we had to fabricate basically long rods for a camera slider and things like stuff that's pretty easy to get here, but impossible to get when we were in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. And so people that solve problems like that, people that can get us a rental car if we need a rental car, find a driver, those sort of things. So we had an initial itinerary was mostly the locations we needed to get to and the amount of time that we had to visit them, right? So that was number one. And we chose sort of the Tigray region of Ethiopia because we could stay in Shire and we could go to Mayani and Hitsats and the other camps that are right there, in a day's drive. So we'd have to drive back to Shire, and then we'd drive to a refugee camp, and we'd drive back to Shire and drive to another refugee camp. And and when we get there, they usually knew that we're coming enough, and then we would just pull people. We'd send we had a translator and a fixer, and we'd walk around with them and just try to see if we could find people that are willing to talk with us, because it was also important for me to not have the camp set up the interviews for us, right? Because you could, if you wanted to hide something, you would hire an actor to say all the things you wanted them to say, right? Or someone that's sympathetic to, you know, to your story as a camp, if you were running a camp or whatever. And if you wanted a certain narrative to your story, you'd pick people for me to interview, and that's not really what I wanted, right? I wanted to go and select the people I wanted to select to make it random, and therefore I could get a more honest account of what was going on. So, you know, our schedule evolved over time, where we went to the Shire region, and then we had an opportunity to go to the Afar region. So we took that opportunity. That wasn't really super well planned. You know, we just got in a car and drove there, and that was an experience. And then we were really fortunate that when we arrived in Ethiopia and in Israel, that they were having the largest largest refugee strike in their history as a nation. So that was just, some of it's luck and some of it is just persistence, I guess.
Well, the film was released in 2015, which coincides sort of with the time that the height of the refugee crisis really peaked around the world. I was interested really in your experience at the refugee camps and also talking with the staff there. When they were telling you some of those statistics about people who had come in and those who were living there for an extended period of time, did it surprise you that there were Eritreans who were there almost in some instances, for the children at least, they were there most of their life? I assume that when you were narrating about your experience as a child versus Eritrean refugees as children growing up in these desolate camps, that it sort of was a stark contrast between what you had grown up accustomed to versus what Eritrean refugees had gone through.
I was surprised how long refugees can stay in a camp. I think the average now, I was just reading not too long ago, is 20 years. And to me, 20 years in a refugee camp just sounds like forever, you know, because people don't have any freedoms there. You don't have, you can't get in a car and just drive down the road, really. You can't explore. You don't have security. You don't know if there's going to be like a supply chain shortage and now you don't have any food. Maybe there's going to be like you're pumping, your well system breaks down. You don't have water. Maybe there's going to be a fight that breaks out. Now you don't have security, and you know, and it's just a kind of a terrible place to live for, you know, 2 decades on average. So I do think that you know, some people live their entire lives in a refugee camp. I mean, we were just in Kenya's refugee camp not that long ago, and you know, that's the same thing there. And people have been, that camp's been open since 1991. Kakuma refugee camp.
Yes, it's really important to highlight some of these issues because as you're going through in the documentary, you talk with refugees, some of them, their faces blurred, of course, to protect their identity. And it seemed like as the film progressed, that the desperation, especially among those who had been there a little longer, started to hit you that there really is a chronic issue of the camps which are being underfunded or not being tended to. Did you try to get some of that aspect into the film? Because I know you were doing some shots of the actual infrastructure of some of the housing, and it had been there for not that long of a time, but the refugees seemed like they would be able to make do with what they had.
Can you ask that question one more time for me?
Sure. So it seemed like as you were going through the film and as the documentary progressed, the experience of the refugees sort of hit you in a sense where they were recounting their stories, and it kind of gave you the sense that they are spending a lot of time in there, and this is sort of an inhumane situation that they're going through. How did that make you feel? Like, were you going through anything that prompted you to say that there would be a response to what they were experiencing?
I mean, I would love to have said that to every refugee that I met. But I felt like I'd be lying if I don't know. I hope, I've met refugees that have been resettled. I know there were a few refugees that were in that film that have been resettled. I know there's the really young guy that I interviewed in there. He's been resettled somewhere in Europe. Those are success stories for me. And I wish that countries would take in more, but I would love to have comforted every refugee that I talked to and could say either, hey, the United States is going to take you in, or somebody's going to take you in. I think the only thing you can say is, have hope and patience, and keep advocating for yourself and keep trying new ways to kind of like, make it happen. The problem is in the desperation of waiting in a refugee camp for 20 years, right? At a certain point, you're going to take some risks if you don't want to be there anymore. I think, right? I would risk taking a small, not very seaworthy boat to Lampedusa. I would risk the Sinai Peninsula and getting kidnapped. I might do that, especially if you hear that people have succeeded in that kind of risky endeavor. I might do the same. And I think, honestly, I would, because I think after 20 years of waiting for someone to save me, I would try to save myself and my family. So I feel for them for that.
Well, one of the children that you spoke to said that, or in response to you saying that you would document their experiences and broadcast it to those who would be willing to listen. He thanked you for it. Did it give you a sense of gratitude or fulfillment that what you were doing was making a difference?
I appreciated him thanking me. That is, I believe, that's the refugee that one of the refugees that I interviewed that did get resettled. And that wasn't from the documentary, but I appreciated his, I thought, honestly, I felt a responsibility to finish the film for every refugee that I made, that I met. So when I came back, that was the real work, is when you come back after filming 50 interviews and whatever, and I think it was 2,000 hours of editing and stuff. And when you really, that's what kept me going. My only promise I could make was to be able to craft some kind of media that could explain their story for them to an audience that was like me.
So you're in Tigray and you're at the refugee camps there. And then you also had the opportunity, I know you said it wasn't initially in the plans to do so, but you also went to the Asida camp in the Afar region. How would you compare the two experiences between Tigray and Afar? You said that it was essentially, the Afar camp was sort of an off the road experience, and it was kind of different from the other camps, even though they were all sort of desperate situations. The Afar refugee camp in particular kind of had a particular impact, I would say. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Afar refugee camp was quite a trip. It was, I think, a 14-hour drive. And the Afar people are, I think, some of the most kind of marginalized demographic as far as refugees are concerned. They're treated really poorly in Eritrea, and that region of Ethiopia is really, really, really hot. It's really dry. It's really remote, so it's hard to get supplies to. And you combine that with its sort of hostile. Like there are kidnappings all the time in that region. Um, there's a lot of there's a lot less security there than there is in the Shire region. There's a lot less technology there than there is in the Shire region. There's a lot less roads and infrastructure there than there is in the Shire region. So yeah, it was kind of I would say that's the most intimidating part of the trip were those interviews. Just
And
being,
yeah,
yeah.
more generally, when you're talking with refugees, they kind of give you their background or their life story as to how they got there.
Mm.
I was wondering, were there any stories in particular that you wanted to highlight that kind of gave you a sense of fear or sort of confusion as to how could people do this to one another, especially in a situation where these people are innocent and helpless and uh, they really have no way of retaliating? Or what were some of the stories that kind of gave you the feeling that this was unlike anything you had ever heard of before?
Ooh, I think all the stories were kind of gripping in that way. Um, I think learning about like storage container prisons and the searing hot heat. I think that was, every I think society has some version of prison, right? And I just couldn't imagine such a cruel prison when it doesn't necessarily need to be something like that. Even if it's a prison, you need a prison, you need a prison. But to have like a storage container baking in the sun just seems terrible. Shooting people that are trying to cross the border, seeing people that you're crossing the border with drop because they've been shot. Those sort of stories are just terrible. Um, yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to highlight, while you were in Ethiopia, you also had the chance to speak, not directly, but through your translator, with some of the adults or some of the facilitators of the actual camps at the
Mm.
sites of these camps. I was wondering, when you were speaking with them, what was your uh, moment of acknowledgement that the situation had in those refugee camps had really deteriorated? I know that when you spoke about the statistics of the populations of the camps, it was sort of mind-boggling for you to comprehend how so many people could live in such desolate circumstances. When you were speaking with the facilitators of these camps, what was it that surprised you, or what was it that got you to think more about the situation?
So you're referring to like as the facilitators, like the heads of the camps.
Yes.
There was one guy, I think, in the film that I was talking to. Um, uh, the numbers, the staggering numbers, and how many people would come in per day, and how many they got in yesterday, and then how many they got in last week, and when they would go over those sort of numbers, it just felt like kind of an insurmountable or unsustainable population to care for. Um, and in some camps, right, their systems are holding, or they were then, right? So they had running water, they had access to toilets, they had food, at least life supporting food. Maybe not it's not like going to Giant or a grocery store here and choosing avocados that are flown in half across the world, right? It's things like dried peas and cornmeal and just enough water to get by. You're not taking a shower every day. So they had what I would consider, for the most part, life support. But I will say they also, there was a lot of delicious coffee, and that was one of my favorite treats when I go to these camps and meet some of these people. They would a lot of times treat us with hot, delicious coffee, and so. But talking to the camp facilitators and the camp managers about the sheer numbers, and then some of their hurdles, right? Some of their some of their issues are having enough tents, which you don't think should be a problem. You know, having enough tents, having enough clean water, having enough access to, um, you know, food and medicine, and you know, there's quite a bit of support, even if you're just providing bare necessities for people, that really needs to be given to a refugee camp to run it well, and staff. You know, you need security. You need to make sure that people aren't coming into camps and you know, trying to kidnap people. You need to make sure that camps in inter-camp disputes are settled without violence, and that those are always sort of the kind of typical problems of a refugee camp.
Well, Chris, something else that I wanted to highlight as you were experiencing the refugee camps in Ethiopia, it was something that I certainly noticed when I was watching the film for the first couple of times was some of the, as you mentioned, the hospitality that was shown to you when you were there. These refugees who really don't have much offered you so much to enhance your experience and to really get to know more. There was one scene in particular where two men offered to give you some bread, and you said that as much as they need it, the fact that they gave it to you kind of shows that they really show compassion for those who want to take the time to learn about their struggle. I
Mhm.
was wondering, I was wondering, when you reflect on that experience, what is it like for you to think about those who want to really show a sense of sympathy for the refugees who are in the camps who have all of the problems in the world, but yet still chose to show you what it's like to have anything that you'd like. You said that they were willing to give you what they had.
Yeah, that was a special moment for me too. Um, yeah, I mean, first of all, just being welcomed into, you know, their home and being able to sit down. You know, I just poked my head in, right? I was touring the camp, and there were people inside, and they were like, "Poke your head in." They were like, "Come on in," you know, um, and then to be offered, you know, some of their food was really kind of them. Um, and I think, I mean, it's not everybody, not everybody's like that, right? So some people are more selfish than others, and that's why you have problems in any culture or society, right? Whether it be a town or a camp. Um, but I did get the sense of, for the most part, like, you know, people are in it to support each other, right? Everybody's kind of left these sort of um, terrible situations with the idea that they've left it behind, even if they're in this like weird purgatory place where they could just have to like hang out and wait for the next thing. At least they've gotten to that point, right? So in that sense, it builds a really strong community. You know, and these camps too, like there, all these people in these camps are Eritrean people, so they have a common culture. They have a common situation they're all fleeing from. So there is a real sense of support in those communities, even as a refugee camp. They build uh, leadership. You know, they have people that are in charge of things. They run their own camps for the most part, and they welcome visitors. They welcome new people, and I believe that they would have done the same for anyone, not just because they were hoping that maybe I could, you know, have a sympathetic to ear that will get them placed in some place. I believe that it wouldn't have mattered if I was a brand new refugee coming to the camp, that they would have offered the same hospitality. You know, so I was just really grateful for that moment, and that snack, and you know, it just goes to show that there are sort of nice, caring people pretty much anywhere you go. You just kind of have to look for it, right?
Absolutely. I would like to transition from your experience in Ethiopia to your experience in Israel. And of course, your trip to Israel and your time spent there was sort of a flashpoint, I guess, for your travel when you were doing your work on the Eritrean refugee situation. You experienced many different things during your stay, and just some of the highlights that I want to go over with you. First of all, the protest. We were speaking about how large this protest was, and I'm sure Sigal Rosen told you about the sheer numbers of Eritrean refugees who had gone on strike, a workers' movement to ask for asylum in Israel. How did that experience shape you, or what did you think about that?
I mean, so we almost didn't do that part of the trip. Again, we were like kind of feeling budget crunches, and I was wondering if it was an important part of the trip. And when I was on the phone with John Stopper from the American team, he was like, you've got to go. Like there's this migrant protest literally when you land that day. Uh, so I was like, okay, well, I guess we'll go. I mean, I thought it was important to see kind of, where people were trying to head to. Um, and it was literally, we got off the plane, we got on a bus, we got in a car, and we ended up at the Knesset when everybody was protesting. And it was just a sea of refugees. And seeing that would really put some perspective on like how huge the problem is, not only in Israel, but that's only Israel. There's these problems are happening in Italy, they're happening in Europe. This is right in the beginning of all of the refugee crisis that was happening now in Europe. And a lot of that was because, we were following sort of the migration path of refugees that were heading to Israel. And pretty much right when we got there, they just finished, their border walls and things like that. So refugees were finding it was very difficult to get into Israel. So then they were choosing a new path, and then trying to get to Lampedusa, through these boats. And that was the same year that we had the first Lampedusa boat tragedy, where I forget how many Eritrean refugees drowned, but it was significant, and these boats just keep coming, right? So we chose to go that route, and to see this number of people march the Knesset, kind of in mass, just really shows how huge the problem is. And when you think of that, and then also think of like the problems in Lampedusa and throughout Europe and other countries, it really, I've said it, I think earlier too, it's just not sustainable. A lot of this stuff is just not a sustainable solution.
Well, during the protest, you were speaking with an Eritrean refugee who eventually had to turn down your interview because he was afraid that he would be identified by the government. Did that also give you a sense that what was happening was not normal?
There were a few things that happened that way. There were plenty of people I asked to be interviewed. First day, I think we were interviewing people, and they just couldn't have their faces shown. They were brand new, like refugees just fresh in. Um, it, I was told not to tell anybody where I was going beforehand, just to be on the safe side. Which to me, I was like, that sounds kind of crazy. You know, why would that matter? Why would anybody track me down? And it goes to show how fearful people are, and why they would risk everything to leave a country like that, whether or not it's true that someone would recognize them, right, and try to come after them. And maybe that's true. I believe it to be true. But even if it's not true, just that's how afraid that person is of their own government. And in my opinion, that right there is worth asylum status. If you're that afraid, you're petrified of your own government for your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, then that's asylum status.
Yeah, I did want to ask you a little bit about that. Sigal also mentioned that Eritreans sort of have a problem with public relations in the sense that they can't express their problem in a way where other people could understand or empathize the way they see the situation. And you're talking about feeling intimidation from the government. Sometimes people who are in host countries don't necessarily have the full nuance to understand the gravity of the situation. And I wanted to ask also about the Israeli man who confronted you and the Orthodox priest you were with when interviewing him about his experience. What do you think Israelis, but I could just ask more generally about the global population, what do you think people need to know about the circumstances of refugees in Israel, but across the world? What do you think people need to know?
I think Israel is a good example um, of just kind of a communication breakdown between refugee and another government, and that the problems in Eritrea. Um, if you told an Israeli person that you're leaving because you didn't want to go into the military, well, they have forced conscription in Israel, right? It's a certain amount of months and you're out. I mean, they have that in lots of countries. There's plenty of countries that when you turn a certain age, you have to do service for a certain amount of time, and then you're done. To an Israeli, it sounds like you're sort of like a draft dodger, right? It sounds like you're someone that's not willing to serve your country. So why should you be welcome in mine, right? Is their kind of mentality. Um, or it's because you're lazy and you don't want to work in your country and you think that you can make more money in a different country. And we see that here in our country, in the United States. We see that with people from Central America coming up and through like Mexico and all those Central American countries that are coming in, and we have a refugee crisis on our own border. And I would say it's very similar. Americans don't understand what's happening in Central America that makes these people risk everything to come to our border for safety. And we would say the same thing. The man that kind of interrupted our interview with the priest in Israel, I didn't think he was a terrible person. Things got heated. He got upset. But he's frustrated because he doesn't really understand what was going on, right? Which is why, and you'll see my reaction. Well, you've watched the film, but anybody would see my reaction. I'm not angry at that guy who was getting heated. I felt for him. I felt bad. Like he could be an uncle, who's just doesn't know any better. Everybody's got those uncles on Facebook where you're just like, oh, stop talking already. Just you don't even understand what you're talking about, right? And they could have been a relative of mine who was the same kind of situation. So I think that films like this that can kind of show people really what's going on can be really helpful for that reason.
Well, having that experience, I think, gives you a lot of insight as someone who previously didn't know about the situation, but also what gave you some pertinent information were all the interviews that you did with all the professional experts and other colleagues of yours or people you connected with through the America team or others that spoke to you about the situation in Eritrea. And you spoke to a myriad of people, including Sigal Rosen and other people from the US State Department, Amnesty International, just to name a few. What were the takeaways that you got from those interviews as well? You obviously had to prepare a lot in order to ask the questions that you did, and those are available on your website as well. What were some of the things that you learned from those interviews, and what was your perception of the issue when you got more of an informed look about the Eritrean refugee crisis?
I think the those interviews were really important to me because they were, I'm not a refugee professional, right? I'm a storyteller, I'm a documentarian, I'm a lot of things, but I don't live it every day. And so these people were important because they corroborated all the stories of the interviews for the refugees that we met. Um, they've had their reports, they've had their studies, they live and breathe this stuff every day. Interviewing Ann Richard from the U.S. State Department was a huge opportunity for us to get a real kind of understanding of what's happening in refugee camps in general, but also in, just specific to Eritrean refugees. And all of those professionals, I felt really fortunate that they would take time out of their day to kind of explain the situation to me, so we could translate that to the public. It's important, because if you don't talk to those people, then you don't really have the whole story.
Well, in closing, I'd like to ask about the feedback and the receptivity of the film, and moving ahead in your future work dealing not only with the topic of refugees, but more generally about traveling and your experience of having a better understanding of the issues around you. Since filming Refugee, the Eritrean Exodus, you got to spend some time as well in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, which is the second largest refugee camp in the world by population, with over 200,000 people. You said that in your blog that the quote primary objective of that work would be to provide an opportunity for refugees to tell their own stories, while also exploring various contributing factors, including how foreign policy decisions affect these fleeing populations. My question is, how was that experience like for you as well? Was it analogous to your experience in the Tigray region?
The Kakuma refugee camp feels so different. I mean, a lot of the stories are similar, right? A lot of the reasons why people leave their countries, civil conflict, that kind of thing, religious persecution. But that camp, the Kakuma refugee camp, is so old, it's developed into, like, it's got its own economy. It feels more like a city or a town than a refugee camp. It's less, I want to say that it's less guarded in its borders, but that's partially also because of its location. Like, there's really nowhere to go. You have a little bit more freedom to come and go, but you still have to be down, in your neighborhood at sundown, and people like me aren't allowed in the camps after sundown. That's to protect everybody, right? And it felt a little bit different. I didn't need to be escorted so much in the Kakuma refugee camps, and I was there for different purposes. The first trip that we took there was just kind of more of an exploration thing. We had an opportunity to go as sort of a people that saw our documentary about Eritrean refugees, and they said, well, there's this other refugee camp. I'd love to take you and show you around there. And I thought, okay, well, we'll just keep telling refugee stories. It's nice to have access to these places, and I think there's still a lot of work that we can do to kind of help refugees in general. So I took them up on it, and then we were able to go back, I think a year later, to teach refugees like techniques in filmmaking through an organization called Film Aid, which they have in Kakuma, and they did have it in Dadaab, but then I think they closed Dadaab, but it doesn't matter. Film Aid's in Kakuma, and they teach refugees filmmaking techniques and journalism techniques and things like that. So we were able to go and support refugees there, and try to teach them something in a few weeks, and hopefully they get a little bit out of it. But yeah, so the feeling of those refugee camps just felt very different, right? The Eritrean refugee camps in Ethiopia are exclusively Eritreans. Kakuma refugee camp has, I think, 17 different nationalities that live there. So it's sort of a melting pot kind of refugee camp. And they did that on purpose, right? They wanted to kind of mix everybody up. Well, they didn't accept this many nationalities on purpose, but they did mix up the population to try to help to cut down on like tribalism and things like that, and fights. And so it's interesting because you'll see all of these creative or these cultural differences, like as you walk down, the gravel roads of these refugee camps that are just kind of amazing.
Were there other people who you were able to speak with at Kakuma that you wanted to share your experience with?
You mean refugees or
Mhm.
people?
Yeah.
Yeah, we and we have a few things I think on our YouTube channel now, and I think we have from Kakuma we have sort of just a message to stand with refugees, that we kind of just gave to the UNHCR. We also have a little video we made to help support Film Aid, and then we have these two really powerful spoken word pieces that I think are excellent. And I have a ton of things that I still need to edit and kind of, get out there. So we started Tailor Made Films. My production company is Tailor Made Media. And Tailor Made Films is sort of like a philanthropy company, right? So our idea is that we, as a production company, as Tailor Made Media, we take a pretty large percentage of our profits and put it towards kind of do good film projects, right? Like telling refugee stories. So we have a series about refugees, and we have another series about water related environmental issues. And so that's what we're doing. And so we were able to, talk to a few refugees and try to tell some of their stories. And the two that I think on our YouTube channel right now is the spoken word pieces from Yamad and David. And they're different, it's artistic. It's spoken word. It's rap without a beat, and but the stories are really, really powerful. And we have lots of other things that are sort of ready to be edited. I feel like there's just never enough time in the day to do everything you want to do, right? So we have another Eritrean family that we met when we were in Ethiopia. No, sorry, we were in Kenya the first time. Who has been resettled to the United States. So I'd love to kind of follow up on them. We have some kind of longer term things I'd love to do. And then there'll be plenty of those shorty sort of like, stories on really how refugees live to try to understand why they need support, And I just don't like telling the stories of really anybody that's sort of in these sort of situations. I don't like to tell the stories of like, oh, you poor refugee, that poor person, because that's not really how I feel. I think it's more of a inspiring refugee or an empowering refugee, or, look how amazing these people are. They deserve support. They're going to do it anyway. They're going to, I believe that if you keep moving in a forward direction, something good will happen. But you can get there a lot quicker with some support from people, right? And I think that's our job. People that have the resources, whether it be financial. Unfortunately, mine's not financial, but mine is time, and I have a certain set of skills that I can kind of contribute to these sort of things. And I just think that that's the point of it all, is to really be enamored by the power of humans, and be enamored by the power of and courage of these people that find themselves in these temporary homes. And hopefully people can kind of, give each other a leg up, offer somebody a little sweetbread and, help people out.
Well, Chris, there's maybe a difficult question to answer. Typically, many people attribute the phenomenon of white savior films as being nothing more than shock pieces trying to undermine the topic of discussion. But it really seems that throughout the process of your film that you kept an open mind and you went into unknown territory that many diaspora Eritreans either don't get the chance to go to or would choose not to. How would you respond to some of those criticisms that you were trying to empower those refugee voices?
I mean, the white savior had definitely gotten thrown around a few times. There was at one point when I was editing the film, and we had our Kickstarter campaign going. We're raising money to finish editing. Some of the things you need to do for film to even have it released. All that took a lot of money. So we raised money through a Kickstarter, and man, just some of the things people say are really discouraging, and it does make you question whether you're doing good for someone or are you like part of the problem. But for me, it was, I mean, at that point, I'd already talked to so many refugees and had already gotten kind of the message right from the source that I knew that the story that I was telling was authentic and it was correct. It still hurts when you're trying to do something good for people and you have like people threatening your life and people threatening your, intentions or questioning your intentions. And just the whole thing's really, it's challenging, but it's less challenging than living in a refugee camp.
Yes, there was one response that I want to note that you received from an pro-government Eritrean website accusing you, among other things, of having fabricated the entire experience and the testimonies before the film's release. And you wrote in that response that you were surprised that the person watched the film before you released it. And I think that goes into what you're saying about being discouraged about releasing the film. But I can assure you that many Eritreans that I know not only watched the film but enjoyed it. How do you take in all of the feedback that you've gotten from over the years? I know people who just watched the film for the first time not so long ago. What is your takeaway message from the film that you want others to get at?
I think my takeaway for just anybody who would watch it would just keep an open mind. The stories that I collected were the stories I collected. Um, the I presented them as truthfully and as honestly as I could. And I would also say, for the most part, I mean, the goal of any film is for people to watch it. I know that it's people have seen it, and I hope that it helps refugees who need to prove their asylum status, gives them a story that they can point at to be like, this is pretty much what I'm going through. And I would hope that even if it's not for people to just understand the Eritrean refugee crisis, but to understand like the Eritrean refugee crisis is not unique to Eritrean people. The Eritrean refugee crisis is very similar to a lot of other refugees out there. So I think in that way, if people could just keep an open mind to refugees they encounter, when you have an opportunity to support people who are going through such a situation, maybe don't be so quick to criticize what they're going through and realize that, like, people have it hard in some places, way harder than definitely I do, and way more harder than most people I know.
Well, considering what has happened in the Tigray region since November 2020 with the rise of the conflict happening in Ethiopia, do you plan to do any follow-up projects on Eritrean refugees or on Eritrea? What are some of your plans on that?
I think I'd love to. I'd have to see how things pan out a little bit with that. It's it's. I think I'd love to. The logistics of it would be challenging for me, but I think it would be something I'd be open to. I still have our connections in that area. I think that the civil war that's happening in northern part of Ethiopia is tragic. And I think it's just kind of sickening that refugees, those camps, at least in that Shire region, are kind of caught in the middle. And that's just really upsetting. And like I said, go through so much and to be in a camp and just to be worrying about your safety, and then for a civil war to erupt around you is like just heartbreaking.
Well, to end on a positive note, I wanted to ask maybe a slightly more personal question.
Sure.
Did you share the film with any of your friends and family, and what did they think about the experience that you went through? And did you tell your friends and family about Eritrea and how you came to know the situation?
I did. Well, yeah, I had an opportunity to share the film with quite a few people. We had a like a debut release here in the States, or in my neighborhood, in my town, and it was sold out, which was nice. We had like two nights sold out here. We did a week in the UK, where we were able to show the film there. We did some kind of, people could screen it in the United States at select theaters, and a lot of colleges picked it up to show on their campuses. And we did some director Q&A things with that too. I think my family was, I come from we're fairly, I would say, fairly liberal, kind of just happy to have the lives that we have, and feel lucky for what we have. I think my family was a little surprised at the endeavor, but I don't think they were shocked they know me pretty well. They knew this is something that I would love to do, and I talked about wanting to do something like this, and they were really supportive. And I think when they saw it the first time, I don't think they expected what they saw, and I don't think really anybody would expect what they'd see when you watch it the first time, unless you've been there and know the story. I don't know if I don't know how you could see it see it coming. You know what I mean?
Well, Chris, I'd like to give you the final word.
Oh, okay. What word should I say?
Well, you're free to say anything you'd like. Yeah.
Well, I'd say thank you for inviting me to have this discussion with you. I'd also encourage everyone, like I said, just to keep an open mind about the world around them. The world's a big place, but it's also very tiny. We have we have an abundance of potential, but we have a limited amount of resources in our environment. We have a limited amount of resources in our space, and we just really need to keep in mind that we need to protect each other and believe in each other. And I mean, it sounds a little hippie, but I think we can kind of all get through this stuff together, if we just sort of work together.
Chris, I also want to give you the chance to advertise your businesses while I still have you. You can go ahead and advertise whatever you'd like.
Oh, wow, cool. So, Tailor Made Media, obviously we couldn't have done this film without my crew here at Tailor Made Media. Tailor Made Films is, I think I was telling you about, the sort of nonprofit arm of Tailor Made Media that's trying to do kind of the do good films. So I believe if you go to youtube.com /Tailor Made Films, or just search Tailor Made Films, you'll see some collection of refugee stories, and a collection of environmental stories. And then, Tribe Sound Records is a recording studio, but I think that's second to, all the filmmaking stuff. It's pretty on topic here, right?
Chris, I'd like to thank you for coming onto the platform.
Thank you, George.